Please fasten your seatbelts, because even though we will be remaining in India for all of the present lecture, we are going to be traversing quite a few centuries of Buddhist thought and introducing some rather revolutionary ideas within the Buddhist tradition. In our last lecture, we looked at the very foundations of Buddhism. We looked at the ideas of impermanence, selflessness, and interdependence that animate all of Buddhist thought, and the Four Noble Truths that represent the foundations of Buddhism. Today, though, we're going to be jumping initially about 500 years from the time of the life of the Buddha to about the turn of the first millennium, and we're going to introduce the Mahayana Buddhist revolution. Mahayana means greater vehicle. We're going to introduce that revolution and the new ideologies that it involved. I'm then going to tell you a little bit about one of the principal philosophers within that tradition, the 8th century philosopher Shantideva. We're going to talk about the idea of the Bodhisattva path, which is central to Mahayana Buddhism. The idea of a Bodhisattva is the idea of somebody who altruistically commits him or herself to attaining awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings. The word Bodhisattva literally means a being aimed at enlightenment. And then I'm going to spend a bit of time talking with you about an interesting piece of Buddhist iconography, which is usually called the Wheel of Life, because that piece of iconography, which you can find at the entrance of any Tibetan Buddhist temple and in classical India would have found at the entrance of any Buddhist temple, animates in an important way the text that we will be discussing in the next lecture, Shantideva's great text, Bodhicharya Avatara, or How to Lead an Awakened Life. So that's the plan for today. Let's begin by talking a little bit about the rise of the Mahayana. First, a word about the term Mahayana itself. As I said, the term Mahayana means great vehicle. Maha means great, yana means vehicle. Now, oftentimes when people use this term, we have to confess that they use it as a contrast with another term, which is usually referred to as Hinayana. The term Hinayana literally means lesser or inferior vehicle. And notice that it's pejorative. Practitioners of that vehicle didn't coin it. It was coined by practitioners of the Mahayana. Usually, in present days, in order to be a bit more welcoming and a bit more ecumenical, we prefer the term Shravakayana, or the vehicle of disciples. The early Buddhist ideas that we talked about and the teachings of the historical Buddha Sid and the commentaries on those form the basis for the Shravakayana, the disciples' vehicle tradition, which is very much alive in places like Sri Lanka, Burma or Myanmar, and Thailand. The Mahayana, the greater vehicle, arose in India between the 1st century before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era, and spread north to China, Japan, Korea, and Tibet, and forms the basis of the Tibetan traditions in those parts of the world. Now, we often refer to the Mahayana revolution, but it's not so much a revolution, I think, but an evolution of Buddhist thought. It's an evolution in at least two aspects. One is that it brings the idea of lay practice and of lay Buddhists more to prominence. Pre-Mahayana Buddhism is largely a Buddhism based in monastic orders. Lay people made offerings to monastics, endowed monasteries and so forth, but serious practice was thought to be a monastic prerogative. Once the Mahayana comes in, lay practitioners become valorized. The second is that the social face of Buddhism, the communal face of Buddhism, develops, and we'll see an ideal of personal self-development gradually evolve into an ideal of altruistic practice and of social virtues. Now, even though it was evolutionary initially, at some point it really became seen as a revolution, and it became controversial. And we see in a lot of early Mahayana literature and in non-Mahayana literature of that time, polemical treatises. Mahayana literature that is polemically arguing that the Mahayana really is superior, Shravakayana literature arguing that it's heretical, and so forth. So it's clear that it became controversial, but after a while in India, it really became the dominant movement. Now the Mahayana begins with the, now we have to be very careful, the discovery or the propagation or the composition of a set of controversial sutras, the Mahayana Sutras. So let's pause for a minute on the meaning of this term sutra, a Sanskrit term that has its Pali equivalent sutta that we've encountered when we talked about the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. The word sutra, literally it's the root of the word thread, suture, and what it means is a discourse or a story. In the Buddhist context, though, it means something very specific. A sutra in Buddhism is a text taught by the Buddha or taught in the presence of the Buddha and authorized by the Buddha. For that reason, you would think that upon the death of the Buddha, we have an end to sutras because he's not there to teach or to give authority to these texts anymore. But somewhere around the beginning of the millennium, a whole bunch of new texts calling them sutras, the so-called Mahayana Sutras, arise. Among those, most prominently are the so-called Prajnaparamita Sutras, or Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And the story about these is, this is the official story from within the Mahayana tradition, is that in fact, the Buddha taught these during his life, but he taught them only to a select group of people. And he recognized that they were very difficult to understand, very complex, very profound, and that if they fell into the wrong hands, they'd be misunderstood, and people would in fact be undermined by them rather than educated by them. So he thought they had to be kept secret for a long time until people were ready to read them. So he did with them what you would do with any text that you wanted to hide for a long time until people were ready to read them. What's that? Well, you know what you would do. You would hand them to a group of friendly sea serpents to keep them on the bottom of the ocean. And according to the Mahayana practitioners, that's exactly what the Buddha did. He took the sutras, handed them over to some sea serpents, said, please keep these safe at the bottom of the ocean for roughly 500 years until a guy named Nagarjuna comes to the shore and asks for them, then please return them to him. Now, you can believe that if you want, or you can believe, as many contemporary heretical scholars do, that monks needing a foundation, a legitimation for these new ideas evolving in the Mahayana started composing these sutras along with an authentication story. We usually refer to this arising of these Mahayana texts as the second turning of the wheel of doctrine. That's the canonical way of thinking. The first turning was the turning at Sarnath with the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta and the enunciation of the Four Noble Truths. The second turning of the wheel is the Mahayana turning, the Madhyamaka turning, or middle way turning, in which the Prajnaparamita Sutras form the foundation, and the texts of people like Nagarjuna, who flourished in the 2nd or 3rd century, Bhavaviveka a few centuries later, Chandrakirti, Shantarakshita, and Shantideva figure. There's also a third turning, by the way, and we're not going to talk much about it. That's the turning that involves the so-called Yogacara or Chittamatra texts, which gives us a Buddhist idealism. But we're going to set that aside for now, but I want you to know that it's there. There are two big ideas that emerge in the second turning that represent the real revolutionary content of the Mahayana. The first, on the metaphysical side, is the idea of emptiness. This is a hard idea, but I want to give you some flavor for it. The idea is that when we think about primal ignorance, when we think about the innate confusion that's the root of suffering, in the Mahayana, that is understood as the conviction, the innate tendency to think that phenomena around us, as well as we ourselves, have inherent existence, that we exist with essences, that we are substantial, independent things. And, in fact, the claim is that we are empty of that the fundamental nature of things is to be empty of essence, empty of permanence, empty of substantiality. And so that to understand things as they are is to understand them as empty in this sense. But to be empty in this sense is not to be non-existent. It's not some great luminous void. Rather, it is to be conventionally designated, interdependent, and not substantially existent. These are held to be the two truths about things. The ultimate truth, their emptiness of essence. The conventional truth, the ordinary functioning as interdependent things. And Nagarjuna famously argued that these two truths were very different. Emptiness is the profound ultimate truth. Conventional truth is a more superficial truth. But they are nonetheless, in a deep sense, identical. To understand that things are empty is to understand that they are just conventional. To understand the real conventional reality of things is to see that they must be empty. So that's the metaphysical side of the Mahayana. But there's also an important moral side to the Mahayana, and that is the Bodhisattva path. Because in pre-Mahayana, or Shravakayana Buddhism, the kind of moral or practice ideal in Buddhism is the idea of the arhat, the extremely realized being. And that is the ideal of a person who really comes to understand the Four Noble Truths, who really practices the Eightfold Path, and who, him or herself, achieves the cessation of suffering and a life beyond suffering. That is the ideal there. It's the ideal of an individual practice. The Bodhisattva ideal is very different. The ideal of the Bodhisattva, the being aimed towards awakening, is the ideal of somebody who commits him or herself to attain full awakening, Buddhahood, in order to benefit other sentient beings. And it goes something like this. Like imagine, for instance, suppose that you really looked around and saw how much suffering there was in the world, and you committed yourself to alleviating it. The first thing you might notice is it's really hard to do. There's a lot of it, it's very complex, and you actually need skills. Now, the Bodhisattva is somebody who resolves to get that arsenal of skills, to know everything he or she could possibly know, to perfect herself as a human being to the degree that's possible, in order not to just be a great person and to relieve her own suffering, but to relieve the suffering of all others. That's the Bodhisattva ideal. It involves a resolution to do this, not just a wish that it would happen, a commitment, a full-fledged commitment to attain full awakening in order to benefit others. That's the new ideal in the Mahayana. So when we put together the idea of emptiness and the Bodhisattva ideal, you have a sense of how, about 500 years later, Buddhism develops a kind of deeper metaphysics, but also a more committed social face. The principal figures in this movement, as I said earlier, are people like Nagarjuna, his commentator Chandrakirti, Buddhapalita, and Bhavaviveka. And then in the third turning part of the Mahayana, the Yogacara tradition, the brothers Vasubandhu and Asanga, Shantarakshita, and the person we're going to consider today, the 8th century Buddhist philosopher, Shantideva. So let's talk a bit about Shantideva now. Shantideva taught at the great Buddhist university, Nalanda, which is in present-day Bihar. He lived in about the 8th century. This is near the zenith of medieval Indian Buddhist culture. It was a period in which there were thousands of monasteries across India, many of them extraordinary institutions of higher education. Predominantly, we had Vikramashila, Taksashila, and Nalanda, which were then the 3 largest universities in the world. And in fact, Nalanda itself was the largest university in the world for over 500 years. So you can think of this as the Harvard, Princeton, and Yale of the classical Indian world. Nalanda itself occupied an area of about 10 square kilometers, about 2 kilometers across, about 5 kilometers long. That's about 1.5 miles by about 3 miles, and was home to over 10,000 monk scholars. So it was a big university and had a vast library, probably the largest library of the ancient world. It's said that when the Muslim invaders sacked Nalanda, the library itself burned for 6 months. This was a huge academic institution. Shantideva studied and taught there. And so you have to imagine this is a period of very, very high culture, a period of very, very deep learning. And Nalanda was kind of the zenith. That's where you aspired to be. So Shantideva was no hack guy. Shantideva's biography is something that we know very little about. We know very little about his life in detail. And that's partly because the only biographies we have are extremely hagiographic. That is, we know that they're kind of exaggerated. But I'll give you a little sliver of the canonical hagiographic biography of Shantideva. The story is that he was actually a rather lazy scholar at Nalanda, and he had this kind of reputation as a kind of layabout good for nothing. And at one point, a group of monks prodded him and said, okay, at the next big assembly, we want you to go up on the teaching throne and give the main teaching to the entire assembly of monks. This was a big, high pressure, high stakes kind of lecture, giving a lecture to the whole faculty and the whole student body. And they thought that he was going to make a fool of himself and it would be great fun. That was the idea. But Shantideva surprised them. He asked them, well, do you want me to teach you something old or do you want me to teach you something new? And so they smiled and said, teach us something new. And so Shantideva mounted the teaching throne. These were big, high platforms on which people taught. And he recited the Bodhicharya Avatara, which is this text for which he is most famous. Now let me talk for a minute about the name of the text before I go any further with the story, because we're going to have something to call it. The text, as I said, in Sanskrit is Bodhicharya Avatara. It's very often translated as a guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life or engaging in the Bodhisattva deeds. And these are all perfectly okay translations. But we can use a much more natural translation that really captures the meaning of the Sanskrit. And what I like to call it is how to lead an awakened life. Because it's a kind of how-to manual. How should you move from a state of benightedness to a state of awakening? How should you behave and conduct your life and make moral progress as a bodhisattva? So it's the setting out of the bodhisattva path, its theoretical foundation, and its kind of practical stages. And I must say, it's a glorious text, as I'm hoping that you will realize. It's the most popular text on Buddhist ethics that there is, the most systematic, and one of the most popular texts in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, one that the contemporary Dalai Lama XIV never tires of teaching. But anyway, back to our story. So Shantideva mounts this teaching throne and he recites this magnificent text that nobody's heard before, the Bodhicharya Avatara. And then he makes the exit of all exits. He levitates from the teaching throne and flies out of the window up into space and is never seen again. That's an exit. I've tried to do this before. It's really hard. I haven't figured out how it's done. And when the monks went to his room afterwards, what they found were 2 texts of the Bodhicharya Avatara written out and nothing else. And the 2 differ slightly. There's a slightly longer version and a slightly shorter version. We're not going to worry about that too much. All of the discussion that we have in our next lecture will come from the long version, which is the one that is more often commented on, and more often commented on, especially in the Tibetan tradition, where some of the most detailed commentaries are to be found. Shantideva did write another text that he also seems to have left behind somehow, though it's not part of this hagiography. And that's a text called the Shiksha Samuchaya, which means a kind of anthology for students. And as an anthology, what it is a collection of passages from earlier Buddhist texts, some from sutra literature, some from scholarly Buddhist literature, of important quotations on ethics, on discipline, on how to lead one's life. And you can think about this as kind of the course reader that goes along with Bodhicharya Avatara. What do I mean by that? Well, often when we teach, we'll have a kind of main textbook in a course, and then we might have a collection of supplementary readings, things that we hope students are going to read along with this main text to illustrate points, to amplify points, to take them deeper. And the Shiksha Samuchaya, the anthology for students, has exactly that kind of relationship to Bodhicharya Avatara. It so far has not been completely translated into English, though that will probably be complete within a few years. So right now, if you want to read Shantideva's work, the text to look at is the Bodhicharya Avatara. And fortunately, it's available in several very good English translations. So that's a little bit about Shantideva, whose text we'll be addressing next time. But now I want to talk about his ideas a little bit. So let's begin by talking about the Bodhisattva path and what it means. As I said, a Bodhisattva is somebody who is aimed at awakening, a being aimed to awaken, and aimed to awaken specifically for the benefit of other sentient beings. And the Bodhisattva path begins, and we might also say ends, as we're going to see later on, with the cultivation of a very particular state of mind. The Sanskrit name for this is bodhicitta. It's a very hard term to translate because what it really means is, if you just break it down lexically, bodhi means awakening, chitta means mind. And awakening mind doesn't kind of mean anything in English. But what it means is a mental state committed to attaining awakening, a resolution to awaken. But it's a resolution, as I said, to awaken for the benefit of others, not for one's own benefit. And it's animated by another kind of mental state, another kind of way of being. And that one we can talk about in more detail now. That one in Sanskrit is called karuna. Karuna is usually translated into English as compassion. And that's not a bad translation. We can think about the Bodhisattva revolution as the replacement of the ideal of self-awakening with the ideal of compassionate engagement, of karuna. And that makes a great deal of sense. But we have to be careful about how we understand compassion as a translation for karuna, just as when we talked about Aristotle, we had to be careful about understanding the word happiness as a translation of eudaimonia. Because like the word happiness in English, the word compassion in English is often taken to denote an emotion or a passion. In fact, if we look at the word, we can see it right there. I mean, it means compassion, to feel with another. But karuna is not about feeling, and it's not an emotion. It's not something that happens to us. It's not something that overtakes us. And it's not something that is non-cognitive. Karuna is a commitment, not an emotion. So now I want to tell you a kind of analogy to give you a sense of the difference between what we ordinarily mean in English by compassion. His Holiness the Dalai Lama sometimes says what we really need to distinguish is compassion as a technical term that means karuna from something more like sloppy sympathy. So here's a way to think about that. Suppose that you went on a trip, maybe a field trip or a business trip or an academic trip or a vacation to some place in sub-Saharan Africa, and you were in the jungle and you came on a village where a lot of people were suffering from a terrible disease, maybe river blindness or something horrible like that. And you're overcome with pity for these people, and you weep, and you realize something has to be done. Now, there's two possibilities. I want you to consider the first possibility first. You say, I can't go back home. I can't go back to America with all of this suffering happening. I am going to stay here and help these people. That's sloppy sympathy. That's how we might normally use compassion in English. Because the problem is that you're not a doctor, and you don't know anything about river blindness, and you don't know how to help these people. You want to be there, you want to do something for them, but all you're going to be is an additional burden on the village, right? People are soon going to have to deal with your malaria and maybe your river blindness. You're going to be an injury got up as a gift. The other possibility is you say, I'm going back home, I'm going to medical school, I'm going to learn how to cure this disease, I'm going to learn what kind of sanitation these people need, and I'm going to come back and do something about it. And you do. That's commitment. That's an altruistic commitment to do something for the benefit of other sentient beings and to alleviate suffering. Karuna conveys this notion of commitment, not this emotional notion of sloppy sympathy. And it's karuna that animates bodhicitta, the resolution to attain awakening for the sake of sentient beings, because of the realization that the only way to benefit sentient beings is to awaken oneself. If you don't know anything yourself, if you don't have the kind of magnificent skills needed to genuinely alleviate suffering, you're just baggage. And it's important to see then that bodhicitta, this aspiration to gain enlightenment, to gain awakening, has to be understood as an aspiration, not as a desire. It's a genuine willingness to do this, not just saying, gosh, I wish I was fully awakened, because if I was fully awakened, I could do so much cool stuff. That's just a desire. Desire is not part of the picture here. It's an aspiration. It's hence a commitment. Now, as we're going to see in our next lecture, Shantideva distinguishes two different levels of bodhicitta. Remember I said that bodhicitta is the beginning of the bodhisattva path, but it's also the end. And that's what we mean here. The first level of bodhicitta, the level that motivates the bodhisattva path, is what Shantideva calls aspirational bodhicitta. It's this genuine aspiration to attain awakening in order to benefit others. And it motivates the arduous task of the cultivation of the bodhisattva path. But because aspirational bodhicitta emerges at the beginning of the bodhisattva path and isn't, in a sense, animated by full awakening, isn't animated by a real understanding of interdependence, a complete grasp of selflessness, an understanding of the import of impermanence. It's not fully engaged. That is, it gets you going, but it doesn't have the depth because it still represents a duality and reflects a duality between subject and object. I say, I want to become awakened in order to benefit others. And that already involves a distancing. By the end of the bodhisattva path, when we've realized the full wisdom, the full understanding of emptiness and of interdependence that makes it possible to see reality as the Buddha thought reality should be seen, then we have this fully engaged bodhicitta with spontaneous awakened action, spontaneous karuna for the benefit of all sentient beings. And so, when Shantideva characterizes the bodhisattva path, he sees it as beginning with one kind of bodhicitta, still a lot more than a wish, still a lot more than an emotion, but ending with a much higher level of commitment to benefit others and to alleviate suffering, along with more skill in doing so. But what of the bodhisattva path itself? What's it all about? Well, the bodhisattva path is characterized by the cultivation of what are referred to in the Mahayana tradition as 6 perfections, 6 aspects of our lives. Remember when we talked about the Eightfold Path? We said that the Eightfold Path was about different areas of moral concern. So in the Bodhisattva path, we have these 6 areas of moral concern that we are meant to cultivate that don't replace but supplement those. The first is a perfection of generosity, to become better at giving and less attached to things. A perfection of propriety, to conduct our lives in a way that we can actually benefit others. A perfection of patience. Patience not only with others and with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune in the world, but patience with ourselves, because it's hard to attain perfection, and one needs to keep working at it. One needs to keep working at it, so there's a perfection of effort. You've got to cultivate your willingness to work really hard. A perfection of meditation. We have to be able to allow the view to settle into us. And finally, at the end, what emerges is wisdom, a full understanding of our own nature and the nature of reality. Now, all of this is kind of reflected metaphorically in this great iconographic image, the Buddhist Wheel of Life. And the Buddhist Wheel of Life, as I said, is a very prominent image in Buddhist temple iconography, one that Shantideva would have been very, very familiar with. At the hub, we have a snake, a rooster, and a pig, representing aversion, attraction, and ignorance, or primal confusion. Being at the hub, they're what animate the entire thing. And then if you look outside of the hub, you'll see the 6 realms of cyclic existence represented. Now, it's easy to think about these 6 realms in terms of the Buddhist cosmology of rebirth and different ways of being. But it's much better to think about these as a kind of iconographic representation of our emotional life. There's a hell realm. Sometimes we feel like we are just being tortured by reality and everything is awful. There's a realm of these pretas, or hungry ghosts, beings with tiny little throats and big bellies who are never satisfied. And every one of us has experienced that emotional state where we're just so needy that no matter what we get, it's not enough. There's an animal realm. Have you ever said of somebody he's behaving like a real beast, where we're just driven by our emotions, driven by our appetites, and don't have any real concern for others? That's the animal realm. On the upper realms, we have 3 realms. We have the realm so-called of the gods, the realm of heavens. And sometimes you've thought, everything is just so perfect, I feel like I'm in heaven. We are sometimes in that emotional state. We have the realm of the Asuras, the superheroes. And you've been in that realm too, where you just feel so proud of what you've done. You're driven by this kind of feeling of great success and great power, perhaps in athletic performance, perhaps you've just accomplished something you wanted to accomplish, and you just feel like an all-conquering being. And then finally, there's the human realm, the realm where we actually live among each other with real sympathy, with real understanding, and with real human interaction. The point about these 6 realms, though, is that every one of them is a realm of suffering. Even those beautiful realms, the divine realm, doesn't last forever. And what it does is it blinds us to the fact that there's suffering elsewhere. That superhero realm blinds us to the fact that we haven't actually done much to benefit others. And the human realm, of course, has its own suffering because of our interconnection with others. So all of these 6 realms of emotional life are orbiting around or turning around those 3 primal roots of confusion, which conditions attraction, which conditions ignorance. And then look at that wheel of life again, because if you broaden your vision, you see that the whole thing is within the jaws of death. And you don't notice it till you look at the background. And that's how death works for us. The iconography of the wheel of life demonstrates that all of this constant cycling between different emotional states, even though it's animated by ignorance or confusion, conditioning, attraction, and aversion, has as its background this anxiety or terror about death. And that's what really drives the whole thing. And so what we have here is a kind of iconographic phenomenology of our moral lives. That's the phenomenology that animates Shantideva's text, How to Lead an Awakened Life. And he's going to try to understand how we can deal with that anxiety or fear of death and transform ourselves from beings who are constantly shuttling between these various states of suffering into beings who can actually do something about it. So in the next lecture, we're going to open the text and see how that works. I hope you'll join me.